Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP's Ukraine War Update Extra video. A video I haven't done, the type that I haven't done too often over the last couple of weeks, haven't been away, so it's good to get back into this. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving the extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into, to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And where should we start? With a nice icebreaker of something that, goodness me, gives me a squeaky bum moment of like clenching, because, and I know that the triggers for these sorts of mines are very heavy pressure. I don't know if they've been deactivated in some way, but these are evidently unlikely to go off. But man, this is uncomfortable watching, in my opinion. So this is an awful lot of mines. Just absolutely insane. Now, are those mines that have been collected, or those mines that are being dropped off to be set, or both? I don't know, but that's a lot of mines, and it's probably in the Zaporizhia direction about what, 2 farmers' fields worth, I guess. Just absolutely incredible. That just I wouldn't be sitting there filming that. I just wouldn't. I'd be like, oh, I'll tell you what, you guys, you go and do that. I mean, I don't smoke, but I'm going off for a smoko at the moment. You know, just somewhere over there. Although not a Russian cigarette, because let's face it, something would blow up. Yeah, incredible. Right, we are going to. I promised to dip into this as a Ukraine latest podcast from the Daily Telegraph, an excellent podcast that I advise everyone to watch. It really is good. This is a chap who is involved. He's a veteran of the Ukraine conflict, as in, I think before the war started, he must have been over there working with the Ukrainians, fighting as well. He is now involved, a British chap involved in training the Ukrainians, and he's already just talked about some of the things to do with training Ukrainians, and then he's asked this question by the host of the show, Francis Durney, and he gives a pretty upfront answer about what he thinks about NATO training. And I did talk about this in, as I said in my news piece earlier, that it's not adapted to the needs of the Ukrainians. Now, this is not to say this is useless. And someone in my threads earlier was saying, well, look, they need a kind of a formal kind of benchmark of training. They need a consistent training so that they're all working to the same standards and singing off the same song sheets. Yeah, I get all of that. But the point he's making is that that's good for your basic training, but a lot of the soldiers being sent on these NATO training exercises are veterans, and they don't need that kind of training. They need, I don't know, other training. And this, he's talking about, there needs to be feedback. The training needs to be dictated by the needs of the Ukrainians.
Now, we've covered on the podcast for several weeks now some of the reporting around problems in training provided by NATO and others. What kind of feedback have you had from Ukrainian soldiers that you interact with on a daily basis?
So I'd be a sinner if I didn't completely correct you, but we've just hit 10,000 soldiers trained in the last month. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, none of our students that I've had, literally 0 of them in the last over a year and a half now, have been through the Western training, and that's purely a geographical coincidence. We're based out in the northeast of Ukraine, quite far east, and all of our...
So this guy, he's based in Kharkiv, a sort of area, and that's incredible to think they've trained 10,000 troops as a non-profit organization in the last, is it the month, he said? I mean, that's phenomenal, a few months or whatever. But yeah, he's evidently, I think, getting very little complaint from the people he trains, but the NATO training is something else.
Our soldiers are sort of actively participating in combat operations, so they don't necessarily have the time to deploy on this training. But what we're seeing is a lot of feedback from the Ukraine space. Obviously, being in Ukraine myself, speaking to individuals and being in that sort of social network. And I'm a former Ukrainian soldier myself as well. So a lot of my friends that I serve with have attended this training. And unfortunately, especially in the run up to the counteroffensive and even now, we're seeing a lot of negative feedback from these Ukrainian soldiers, especially in regards to things like, obviously, the training I don't think has evolved enough to where it began. I think the aspect of setting it up was to train sort of civilians to soldiers, create a basic training platform to create soldiers themselves. And I don't think it's adapted as the war's gone on. So I'll quote a very good friend of mine that I served with, a Ukrainian soldier. He's now currently attending a leadership course in the UK. And his quote of it was, it's very, very basic. He learned anything particularly useful, and it's been focused especially on basic skills and tactics. This individual, not obviously speaking for everyone, served on 2 combat deployments with me, has been injured multiple times since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, has participated in lots of big battles down south. So if you look at it from a realistic point of view, he will have far more combat experience and experience in fighting conventional operations than, say, the average British soldier has. But the average British soldier obviously has far better training. It just needs to be adapted to more of what the Ukrainian. There was a recent sort of tweet thread and something that's been quoted quite here. I met recently with the general in charge of training for the entirety of Ukraine, and we quoted this to him as well. The Ukrainian soldier speaking about training they've received in Germany about how to deal with minefields. And the effective response that the Ukrainian soldier got when he asked the foreign instructors, how do we penetrate these sort of multi-layered minefields, was push to the left or push to the right and try and circumvent the minefield. Obviously, unfortunately, that's not really possible in Ukraine, as hundreds of kilometers stretches of the front line are heavily mined. So definitely there's a bit of either a lack of adaptation or a sort of assumption within the Western militaries that the Ukrainian soldiers they're getting, or an assumption of Ukrainian soldiers in general, is that they need the most basic level of training, which is definitely applicable in a lot of ways. But at the same time, you have to remember that majority of these soldiers have been fighting since February the 24th of last year. And they've participated in a lot of large-scale operations. So they might not have had the training to do it effectively, but they've done it. They know what goes wrong. They know what happens. And it appears, again, hearing from friends of mine that are on these courses or done these courses, that a lot of the times the training then turns to the Ukrainian soldiers teaching the soldiers that are teaching them, from experience, of course.
That's very interesting. Do you think...
So, yeah, that is a fairly damning indictment, although it's not going to be applicable to everyone. There will be a lot of Ukrainian soldiers that do need that kind of basic training, but it just needs to be a little bit more well thought out. Still to receive that training is an advantage to what the Russians are probably not receiving, especially newly mobilized troops. Yes, they do get some training, but I think that's pretty variable as well. Right, we're going to move on to a Justin Bronk thread here. He writes for the Royal United Services Institute and a UK military think tank, and he's a bit of an Air Force expert. He is one that has been talking about F-16s and Gripens, and I told you today in a separate breaking news piece about how the Ukrainians are presently doing some introductory training to the Gripen airframe, the Swedish airframe. That would be super useful if the Ukrainians can get it. We knew it was going to happen at some point, but it's great to hear that it's actually happening now. So that's good. But this is Justin Bronk talking about the F-16. So a thread on the US approval of the F-16 transfer to Ukraine once pilot training is complete. The US decision is important as it clears one of the obstacles to delivery from European operators, US authorization as the original manufacturer. Several issues remain, however. The first is who will service and turn the jets once in country. F-16 is a complex aircraft, and the airframes likely to be sent are quite old. Even on high-risk timeframes, it will take years to train journeymen or master-level maintainers who can supervise and assure. This is one of the advantages of the Gripen, is that actually it's fairly low maintenance and cheap to run. Whereas the F-16, although there's a lot of them, and in that way makes the unit cost of each of these comparatively cheap, it is still more expensive than the Gripen and more difficult to maintain and has a longer logistics trail, but there are more parts. So, it's six of one, half a dozen the other, perhaps, but I still think there is a marginal advantage. I mean, I personally think the Gripen is the best airframe. I'm no expert, right? But I think it's the preferable airframe. It's just that there aren't enough of them constructed, manufactured in the world. That is, to me, the only issue. Other than that, yeah, I think it's a slightly, well, it is an advantage. It has an advantage over the F-16 since it can fire some pretty useful stuff as well. Anyway, he continues. This means that just like any other FMS customer that the US has helped set up with an F-16 fleet, there will be a heavy reliance on civilian contractors to supervise and provide the on-the-job training to Ukrainian maintainers in country, even after months of initial training. This is an issue because any F-16 bases set up inside Ukraine will be priority targets for Russian crews and ballistic missiles. Therefore, more ground support equipment and contractors are needed to enable dispersed basing, and they'll still be actively targeted. So obviously you don't want civilian contractors to be targeted, to be working inside Ukraine, ideally, because they become legitimate military targets, and then it all gets a bit confusing. And do you have effectively NATO in country? Well, no, you've got civilian contractors, but they are foreign contractors, and it's all kind of not ideal. So therefore, you need to do much more dispersal of the bases, so not all concentrated in one place or several places. But actually, is that ideal for the F-16, and is that ideal for logistics, so on and so forth? He continues, this increases the political risk of Western contractors being killed by Russian strikes, and in any case, the US administration has no boots on the ground in Ukraine policy. So no US contractor support is likely without a major policy change there. The F-16s likely to be sent are Dutch, Danish, and Norwegian, but those air forces need their own F-16 maintainers and contractors to retrain on F-35 to support their current fleets. Thus, where the required maintainers come from is a key question that is so far unanswered. Obviously, that's a real serious issue there. Another key question is how to finance this in the near term. F-16 is cheap by Western fast jet standards, but it's still very expensive. Essential US support would have come out of the limited presidential drawdown authority budget for military support to Ukraine as a whole. Given a lack of European capacity, the key is finding a way to support Ukrainian Air Force to set up and sustainably operate F-16s without unacceptably drawing finite PDA budget away from more critical supplies of artillery, ammunition, tanks, IFVs, Patriots, etc. So in other words, the US has got a certain, and this is actually one of the main this was one of the main arguments that F-16s weren't provided, or why they didn't provide F-16s earlier in the conflict. And the Ukrainians understood this as well, because they actually said this, if you remember too, people like Kuleba, I think their foreign minister, was saying that we really want airframes, but we also understand it's not our top priority. So at the time, air defense systems, and actually arguably still that is the case, air defense systems were the main priority. But as they have got more and more air defense systems in place, they can start worrying about getting aircraft sorted. But that works, there are finite budgets going on, right? The US doesn't just have, hey, we've got a gazillion Spondoolies, so we can just do whatever we want. Here, have that, have that, have that. We just got the money to keep going. So they do, although they're giving a massive amount, the US, and it's fantastic. They are still working with a kind of finite budget where they're saying, right, we've got this amount of money to spend on Ukraine. What are we going to spend it on? And Ukraine will have their top list of priorities. And initially in the war, fighter jets were right down here. Like if you think back in March 2020, February, March, April 2022, the Ukrainians weren't going, we need fighter jets right now, because they didn't have to train pilots. That's like a year-long project, right? They're like, we need Stingers, we need javelins, we need etc., 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 ammunition and howitzers and all that kind of stuff. And as they've been given all of those things over time and built up this inventory of that kind of equipment, they're in a place to say, yeah, actually, now we really do need to think about aircraft. I mean, ideally, they would be saying we want everything right now, and that's what people like you and I were saying. Why aren't they getting everything right now? It's because actually everyone had to prioritize it. All the countries had to prioritize what was being given. Now, there's still the argument that they still should have put this in place like a year ago, but it was still like, juggling, spinning plates, and they only had so many hands to spin plates with, right? And it just turns out that the plate that was unable to be spun was the aircraft plate. Although, as I say, people will contest that, right? It will also, sorry, back to Justin Bronk. It will also take significant time to train Ukrainian pilots as formation leaders to execute the complex 4 to 8 ship tactics required for the F-16 to operate effectively near the front line under the concurrent threats of Russian-led surface-to-air missile systems and fighter CAPs with R-37M. So these are the crosshair protections, as far as I understand that, R-37 missiles that the Russians have just greater range with, and so in order to deal with that, you need to have the tactics in place, which means firing not just ones and twosies of planes, but multiple planes to do different things and be able to take out the Russian threats before they take you out. Lastly, the weapons given will be critical to how effective an F-16 fleet can be. Key items like the long-ranged AIM-120D variant of AMRAAM and JASSM standoff missiles have yet to be approved and may be deemed too sensitive to risk and Chinese capture and analysis. So there are, what you load onto these airframes, because some of these missiles might not go off, and they fire them and they land in opposition territory, or at least parts of missiles land in opposition territory, and then they get to look at them, or maybe an airframe gets lost over the lines or whatever, and that's a risk. However, on the other side is, what's the point of having all this stuff if you're never going to use it? It's a bit like, it's a bit like claiming off insurance. What's the point of having insurance if you're never going to claim, because you think, oh, my premium is going to go up if I claim off it? And so you end up never using your insurance and spending your whole life having insurance, spending tens of thousands of pounds on different insurances and never having claimed off it. You're like, oh, okay, well, good. My premium never went up, but I never used it. So I don't know if that's a good analogy, but you get my point. Right, we'll go on to a Mick Ryan thread. We're getting some of the old classics in here. A bit of Justin Bronk, a bit of Mick Ryan. So he's a retired Australian general here, always has good value threads and things to say. My latest article on ABC News explores the challenges of combined arms obstacle breaching in southern Ukraine and why mines pose such a significant challenge. A quick thread on some key elements of the piece. So, the operations to penetrate the Russian defences in southern Ukraine have been subject to much scrutiny. Observations such as the lack of Ukrainian air power, poor training, or insufficient Western equipment have been offered. These have played a role, but there is a more fundamental reason why operations are proceeding slowly. While military technology has advanced in the past few decades, the tactics and technologies for detecting, clearing, and penetrating minefields has not advanced in the past 50 years. It's a really good point. So people are now starting to talk about using thermal optics to detect mines and then using some kind of drone technology to neutralize them, but it's still kind of being adapted as we speak. Really, it's still using the same equipment they would have used in the 1970s to detect mine, where certain other areas of battle, I mean, some things change in war, some things don't. There's still trench warfare going on, for goodness sake. And that, that's been the same for 100 years. But then there are things like drone swarms that we're thinking about, even if they're not there yet. This is on the horizon, and there is a lot of evolution in technology, but just in terms of drones, in terms of mines, not so much. Two recent technological developments have widened the gap between the challenge of breaching minefields and existing solutions. The first is that battlefield observation is now pervasive. So this comes on to kind of the thermal optics, but the fact is you can just see the battlefield so much more. I mean, this is the case actually for stuff like artillery. So we are seeing in this war a move from human observers going out and spotting for your artillery with binoculars or whatever, and being like a real risky forward group, just looking through binoculars and saying little to the left, little to the right. You get my point. Whereas now they don't need to do that at all. You've got drones up there all over the shop spotting for the artillery. So the first is that battlefield observation is now pervasive. This war has seen the development of meshed civil-military network of sensors, analysis, and dissemination of intelligence. This is unprecedented and not a factor when extant obstacle breaching doctrine was developed. The second development is digitized control of fire support. Long-range rockets, artillery, attack helicopters, loitering munitions, and electronic warfare are now synchronized with new era digitized battle command systems, which are in turn linked to the meshed sensor network. Consequently, where decades ago it may have taken some time for an enemy to detect someone conducting a breach of their obstacles, and even longer to bring them under fire, this is now a process that takes a minute or two. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. This is really significant. So we've seen this in terms of counter-battery fire, where if you've got effective counter-battery fire and you are firing your artillery, it can be, as a target, your artillery piece can be acquired, and they can send a counter-battery round right at you within, say, 3 minutes. So 3 to 6 minutes is, you want to be out there by 3 minutes, really. 3 to 6 is a bit dodgy, anything over that, and good luck. But that's why shoot and scoot is really, really vital. It's why you're seeing so many more self-propelled guns being sort of developed over towed howitzers. Yes, towed howitzers will still be useful for transporting in helicopters or planes or whatever, and to be used in certain ways. But actually, self-propelled guns ideally are better because you can shoot and scoot, right? Counter-battery fire is improving all the time in terms of what people can do, because of the joining of observation, communication, intelligence, assimilation and analysis, and then giving out the orders. And you could imagine some years down the line where you just got one machine that does all of that autonomously. I mean, a self-propelled gun that goes out, has some drones it can send out from itself to go and look for targets, and whatever, or just it's a counter-battery self-propelled gun which just drives around, can track ordnance going through the sky, and then go do its calculation and just fire straight back at where that's come from. You just, no one on board, you just send it out and do it. I mean, I can conceptually imagine that, and I'm sure that's a doable thing, right? So to put that in the context of what Mick Ryan's talking about now, you have stuff flying around all the time, everywhere's being observed, and then you've also got satellite as well, and all this kind of stuff. So that if a Miklik is driving along and blowing up some mines, then ideally, from a Russian point of view, they can find that out almost immediately and do some, hit that with artillery. And so this is why the Russians are complaining so much about not having counter-battery fire, because it is really hamstringing them to be able to do effective defense. Like if they're unable to fire back at the people that are firing at them, then that's obviously a huge issue for them. And if they're like saying, "Oh, look, I know there's a Miklik over there, we've got nothing to fire at it," then that must be hugely frustrating. And this is testament to, if that is genuinely happening, testament to how the Ukrainians are just attriting the Russian artillery on a consistent basis hugely. Again, 19, was it today or something like that, piece of artillery were taken out by the Ukrainians, and that's happening every single day. And eventually you will get this situation where the Russians are like, "There's something we need to hit with artillery. We've got any artillery? No? Okay, should we just watch it? Yeah." So there you go. So I'll read this again. Consequently, where decades ago it may have taken some time for an enemy to detect someone conducting a breach of their obstacles, and even longer to bring them under fire, this is now a process that takes a minute or two. This represents an intellectual failure by Western nations. We have not anticipated the application of this new meshed sensor fires complex to modern ground operations over the past couple of decades. There were months where we observed Russian defences being constructed. At the same time, the past year has made clear trends in a reduction of time between detection and destruction of the modern battlefield. Yet still we failed to update the tactics and techniques of breaching minefields. In other words, So assuming the Russians do have their counter battery fire and their drones up and their artillery, just not counter battery fire technically, it's just artillery and observation. You've got a MIC that's blowing up some mines and creating a path through the minefields. The Russians detect it in 2 minutes and they blow it up with artillery. That's still an issue on the battlefield. And what you're saying here is NATO or allied forces, whatever, haven't come up with a solution to this problem. That clearing the minefields requires like a vanguard set of equipment, ideally, to go into the place that all the mines are, because no other vehicle can go there first because you get blown up by the mines. I mean, this is obvious, right? So you have to send those vehicles in, which means that if those minefields are covered by the trenches, which is what ideally the situation is, you have observation, you have covering fire, enfilading fire, or whatever. It means that these often least protected vehicles are the ones that are getting blown up first, which means that you're churning through your very valuable and rarer equipment that can demine, and then you're left with no equipment to demine, and the mines are still there, and you've still got your vehicles. So it's like, well, what do we do? So now they're starting to send out personnel to do it at night, crawling through fields to demine these areas in the hope that that's actually a more effective way of demining areas. But yeah, there's been no progress in this area. So at the same time, the past year has made clear trends in a reduction of time between detection and destruction on a model battlefield, yet still we failed to update the tactics and techniques of breaching minefields. While Ukraine has adapted its clearance techniques, Western military institutions should establish a crash program to develop technologies for minefield detection and clearance that offer significant improvement in the speed and quality of such activities. However, the physical means to assist is just the beginning. Doctrinal innovation is required to explore tactics of undertaking opposed minefield detection and neutralization more quickly without a guarantee of air control. And this is a problem. Like, you can think of lots of solutions to this. I mean, the main solution would be covering the place, like sending up an A-10, and littering loads of lead around and blowing up the fields, right? And then you can drive through there now because we destroyed all the mines because we've blown up the fields. Yeah, and that was relatively easy. Yeah, that's fine. But if you don't have air superiority, you ain't doing that. So then what? And we're at the then what, and no one's really come up with a solution to this. Lots of people on my threads, for example, have come up with loads of innovative ideas, but is that A, workable? B, can you do it to scale? And C, can you do it within, I don't know, 2 weeks' time? That's the issue. There's some great ideas you guys have come up with. It's just like, yeah, we kind of needed that yesterday. So yeah, and use of drones is obviously going to figure somewhere in there. Like sending, ideally, right, you can send up a drone, right, and you can identify exactly where mines are, like to the centimeter. And it'd be even better if you could also identify anti-personnel mines, like butterfly mines or these petal mines or whatever. These much smaller pieces of kit, right? If you could map out where all the mines are, that's your first problem. And your second problem is, can we do something about them? And that would be great if you could send up some drones to go and do that. Go, bish bash bosh, program it in on my mobile phone, send up these 5 drones, they go off and destroy a bunch of mines, come back and it's like, right, we can drive through. And that's ideal. How do you do that? I don't know. But it's going to have to be something like that. You need really effective mine clearance that isn't going to risk really valuable equipment, big pieces of kit like a MIC or something, and the people inside them. You can send up a bunch of drones to go and do it, even if they're like, I don't know, somehow being able to detonate those mines, but repeatedly from the air, without having to drop individual pieces of ordnance on them, which might not even blow them up because they might be pressure mines that need more than just a nearby explosion. I don't. All these things need to be taken into account, but anyway, I'm starting to ramble. So Mick Ryan says at the end, while there is a combat need for this, there is also a massive humanitarian imperative. About 15% of Ukraine is contaminated by mines and UXO, so unexploded ordnance. More accurate and rapid clearance tech and tactics are needed. There is no time to lose. Well said, Mick Ryan. And another important thread here, well, not necessarily important, another thread in in the same vein as ones I've just done from Tatarigami, who says, in my earlier thread in April, I detailed the emergence of a unit named PMC Wolves, comprised, so PMC is a private military company, mercenaries, comprised of mobilized soldiers, presently, not to be confused, I think, with White Wolves, who are a Ukrainian group who do a lot of really effective drone activity, comprised of mobilized soldiers, presently recognized as a 1st Volunteer Reconnaissance Assault Brigade Wolves. This unit has undergone several transformations, more details in this thread, while soldiers and instructors inside the Wolves Brigade identify it as a PMC. Their operational contracts remain under the MOD. And this is where there is this like real overlap between, I mean, essentially PMCs were illegal and now they're being run by the MOD, and the MOD are doing some recruitment in prisons to get convicts to work in their own kind of PMCs. And then you've got Shoigu having, the defense minister having his own PMC, and then you've got Gazprom, and and it's all just a big grey area. Anyway, their operational contracts remain under the MOD, despite possessing a certain degree of autonomy and additional financial backing. Their status and activities are channeled through the MOD. The label PMC might be somewhat misleading, as combat assignments are determined by the MOD. Though supplementary private sponsors contribute to the support in addition to the MOD, the execution of combat tasks and overall coordination resides within the MOD's purview. In other words, these are just outsourced MOD entities, really. They're just doing what the MOD wants. They get part funding by the MOD, perhaps even most of their funding. It depends what the setup is with each individual one. But, they are doing the work of the MOD and being ordered by the MOD. It's slightly different with, I think, Wagner, that did have a degree of autonomy. It'd be interesting to see how that worked, actually, how much autonomy they had. But I think with a lot of these other PMCs, it is basically the Russian armed forces, really, in just under another name. They have a distinct operational pattern. Typically, they stay for 3 to 7 days on the front line, followed by an equivalent rest duration. However, quite often they stay much longer, which is frequently explained to them by inability to evacuate on schedule. Ouch. The Wolves Brigade primarily draws its personnel from 3 sources: convicts vetted through the MOD channels, volunteers, and mobilised under the MOD. Even though they're labelled as a brigade, it doesn't quite fit considering their size and available means. Their primary focus continues to be concentrated within the areas of Solidar and Bakhmut, where their operational scope encompasses a range of tasks spanning from assaults and reconnaissance to drone operations and artillery correction. In my personal view, many of these so-called PMCs function as veiled mobilization mechanism. So it's what's called crypto mobilization, which is how do we mobilize the country without telling everyone we're mobilizing the country, and and by kind of still mobilizing as many people as we can get. And it's things like this. We're going to go around prisons and we're going to conscript people into these PMCs. We're going to bribe people from Kazakhstan. We're going to, so on and so forth, do all these things, but also get an awful lot of people from within Russia, but in a way that isn't just a mass general mobilization. Superficially distinct from the MOD, they promise better conditions. It's a win-win because between oligarchs desiring private forces and the MOD meeting recruitment quotas. So there you go. Thank you for that, Tatarigami. Where are we at for time? Oh, look, I'm going to have to leave the rest of my content for tomorrow, which is fine. So that is just a few bigger threads and topics for you. Hope you found that interesting and of use. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you to all the members of the channel. Hugely appreciated. And I'll give a shout out in the coming days to people who have recently supported me. Thank you so much. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.